In the year 2020, a Chinese submersible reached the deepest point on Earth. Not metaphorically, literally, it descended nearly 11 kilometers into the Mariana Trench to a place called Challenger Deep, where pressure rises to levels that would collapse most materials and where no natural light has ever reached. A place so remote, so completely removed from the world above, that until recently fewer humans had visited it than have walked on the moon. The submarine was called Fendouzhe. In English, the name means striver, and what it found down there has been adding quietly to one of the most surprising bodies of scientific evidence of the last century that the deepest, darkest, most hostile place on Earth is not empty, it is alive, not barely alive, not clinging to existence in isolated pockets. Alive in ways that keep producing findings no one fully prepared for, creatures moving across the trench floor in the thousands, biological communities running on chemistry instead of sunlight, organisms whose forms had never been cataloged before the cameras reached them. And China was not just observing, they were mapping, sampling, returning again and again with better instruments and deeper questions. While much of the world's attention was elsewhere, a quiet and sustained exploration of the planet's last true frontier was already well underway, and some of what China's submersible recorded in those depths is still being studied, still being argued over, still sitting at the edges of what current biology can comfortably explain. In tonight's journey, we descend into the Mariana Trench through the discoveries made by China's deep sea missions and take a closer look at what has been recorded there and the details that remain unresolved. But before we continue, I'm curious, what town or city are you listening from tonight? And what is the time over there? I love seeing how far these science stories travel across the globe. Let's continue. Metal settles into the water with a quiet finality, as if the surface itself has accepted a temporary departure. The Fendouzhe submersible begins its descent, not with speed, but with patience, lowering through layers that gradually separate the familiar world from what lies far below. There is no sudden drop, no dramatic plunge, only a steady surrender to depth, measured in hours rather than moments. Inside, every system operates with deliberate precision, sustaining a fragile pocket of human presence against an environment that does not permit error. At first, the ocean still carries traces of light, faint and diluted, stretching downward in soft gradients. Shapes remain visible, though softened, as if the world is being gently erased rather than abruptly removed. As the submersible continues, these remnants fade without resistance, dissolving into a uniform darkness that does not fluctuate or return. Illumination becomes something generated from within, small beams cast outward that reveal only fragments of what surrounds the vessel at any given time. Communication with the surface lingers, though altered by distance. Signals travel slowly through the immense column of water, each exchange carrying a delay that stretches conversations into something fragmented and distant. The connection remains intact, yet it begins to feel less immediate, as though the surface exists in a separate frame of time. Words arrive softened by delay, and responses follow with the same measured separation, reinforcing a growing sense that the descent is not only physical, but perceptual. Pressure builds continuously outside the hull, increasing with every meter, pressing inward with a force that cannot be felt directly, but is always present. The submersible resists through its design, its spherical structure, distributing stress evenly, its materials engineered to endure conditions that exceed ordinary limits. Beyond that barrier, the ocean applies a weight that would collapse unprotected structures instantly, yet within, there is only a quiet awareness of what surrounds them. Time moves differently during this descent, without external reference points, without changes in light or horizon, progression is marked only by instruments and the slow passing of measured depth. The surface becomes less of a place and more of a memory, something that exists conceptually rather than physically. The separation is gradual but unmistakable, as if each passing hour gently removes another layer of connection to what lies above. Very few journeys follow this path. The difficulty of reaching such depths is not defined by a single obstacle, but by the accumulation of many constraints, each demanding precision, resources, and tolerance for isolation. Engineering must account for pressures that leave no margin for failure. Navigation must function without clear landmarks. Every descent carries the weight of preparation and the understanding that return is not guaranteed by effort alone. As the submersible continues downward, the surrounding darkness becomes complete and uninterrupted, no longer a transition but a constant state. Movement persists through careful control, each adjustment deliberate, each system monitored in quiet coordination. The descent is not an act of conquest, but of entry, a slow crossing into a region where human presence remains rare, sustained only by careful design and an acceptance of the limits that define it. At first, the seafloor does not announce itself with clarity, but with subtle disturbance, a faint shifting within the narrow reach of artificial light. What appears still begins to separate into motion, not abrupt or dramatic, but deliberate, almost hesitant, as if the landscape itself is adjusting to being observed. Fine sediment lifts in slow curls, drifting upward in thin clouds that reveal the presence of something moving just beyond immediate focus. Within these illuminated fragments, small forms begin to resolve. They do not resemble the expectations once carried into this depth, where absence had long been assumed. Instead, there is structure, there is direction, there is life occupying space where none was meant to persist. Movement repeats, not as isolated coincidence, but as pattern, appearing again and again across different descents, each encounter reinforcing the quiet recognition that these are not anomalies. The first confirmations arrive through careful observation rather than sudden discovery. A slight displacement of sediment, a shape altering its position against the seafloor, a motion too consistent to belong to shifting currents alone. Instruments record these moments, but it is the visual evidence that settles the uncertainty, revealing organisms that navigate this environment with a kind of steady familiarity. Their presence does not disrupt the stillness, but becomes part of it, integrated into a rhythm that had gone unnoticed. As dives continue, these sightings accumulate. What once appeared improbable begins to establish continuity, each descent adding another layer of confirmation. Locations separated by distance reveal similar activity, suggesting that life here is not confined to a singular pocket, but distributed in ways that had not been accounted for. The depth itself, once considered a boundary, no longer defines absence, but instead marks a region where life persists under conditions that reshape its form and behavior. This persistence extends beyond previously accepted limits. Depth records are quietly surpassed, not by isolated individuals, but by communities of organisms existing well below the thresholds that once defined survivability. The ocean floor at these levels reveals itself not as an endpoint, but as an extension, a continuation of biological presence into territories that had remained outside human understanding. Scientific expectations begin to adjust, though not through abrupt revision, but through gradual acceptance. Each observation introduces a refinement, each recorded movement, a shift in what is considered possible. The assumption of scarcity gives way to a recognition of adaptation, where life does not resist the environment, but aligns with it, shaping itself according to pressures, darkness, and isolation. There is no single moment where understanding changes completely. Instead, it unfolds through repetition, through the accumulation of evidence that no longer fits within earlier frameworks. The seafloor, once imagined as barren and inactive, reveals a quiet complexity where organisms move with purpose, interact with their surroundings, and occupy niches that had gone entirely unimagined. In this slow unveiling, the boundary between expectation and observation begins to dissolve. The trench no longer presents itself as a place defined by absence, but as one shaped by forms of life that have developed beyond familiar reference. Each descent carries this awareness further, not as a revelation that concludes, but as a steady expansion of what is known, where even the smallest movement becomes part of a larger unfolding presence. There are shapes here that do not hold their form in the way surface life does, as if structure itself has been softened by the conditions that surround them. Along the seafloor, movement appears not through rigid motion, but through gradual shifts, bodies folding and unfolding with a quiet flexibility that seems almost fluid. These organisms do not press against their environment, they yield to it, adjusting continuously to a pressure that never relents. Among them, amphipods move with a steady persistence, small crustaceans navigating the sediment with limbs that remain delicate despite the weight above them. Their presence extends far deeper than earlier models of biology had allowed, occupying regions where cellular stability was once thought unlikely. They do not rush or scatter, instead maintaining a measured pace, as though energy itself is something to be used with careful restraint. Their forms are familiar in outline, yet altered in density and composition, shaped by a world that compresses without pause. Nearby, other organisms drift close to the seafloor, their bodies lacking the firmness that defines most visible life. These soft-bodied forms move in slow, continuous motions, leaving faint impressions in the sediment that gradually fade. Without rigid frameworks, they absorb the surrounding pressure rather than resisting it. Their tissues, structured at a microscopic level to remain stable under conditions that would collapse more conventional anatomy. The absence of hardness is not a limitation here, but a necessary adaptation, one that allows persistence where solidity would fail. Some forms are nearly indistinguishable from the water itself. Transparent bodies catch only the slightest trace of illumination, revealing outlines that appear and vanish depending on angle and movement. These organisms exist at the threshold of visibility, their internal structures faintly discernible, organs suspended within a clarity that offers no resistance to the surrounding darkness. Their presence becomes apparent only through motion, a gentle displacement that reveals life not through shape, but through subtle interaction with the environment. What emerges from these encounters is not simply a catalog of unusual forms, but a gradual reconsideration of what biological limits truly represent. Pressure at these depths alters the behavior of molecules, affecting how proteins fold and how cellular membranes maintain their integrity. Yet within these constraints, life does not withdraw. Instead, it reorganizes, developing biochemical pathways that remain stable under compression, allowing metabolic processes to continue without disruption. The organisms observed here are not exceptions to the rules of biology, but expressions of those rules extended into unfamiliar conditions. This extension challenges earlier assumptions that defined habitability through narrow parameters. Where once there were boundaries, there are now continuities, environments that support life through adaptations that were not previously imagined. The creatures that move across this seafloor do so without spectacle, their existence woven quietly into the fabric of the trench, each form a response to pressures that reshape possibility itself. As observation deepens, these organisms no longer appear as anomalies. They become part of a broader system, one that operates according to principles consistent with life elsewhere, yet expressed through forms that reflect the uniqueness of their surroundings. In this way, the trench does not present impossibility, but variation, a reminder that life persists not by resisting its environment, but by becoming inseparable from it. There are forms of life here that do not rely on strength or rigidity, but on a kind of yielding that allows them to remain intact where resistance would fail. Among these, the hadal snailfish moves with a quiet precision, its presence recorded at depths that extend beyond earlier biological expectations. It does not stand out against the environment in bold contrast, but blends into it, its body shaped not for dominance, but for endurance within conditions that reshape the very idea of structure. Its form appears almost unfinished when compared to surface fish, lacking the firm outlines that usually define muscle and bone. The body carries a soft, gelatinous quality, a consistency that allows internal pressures to equalize with those surrounding it. This equilibrium is essential, as the immense weight of the ocean above does not press inward against resistance, but instead becomes part of the organism's internal state. There are no air-filled cavities to collapse, no rigid frameworks to fracture. Instead, the snailfish exists as a balance of density and fluid, its tissues stabilized by biochemical adaptations that maintain function under compression. Movement is subtle and efficient. Rather than rapid bursts of speed, it glides in short, controlled motions, conserving energy in an environment where resources arrive slowly. The fins, delicate and flexible, guide it with minimal disturbance, allowing it to navigate the seafloor with a steady presence. Its muscles do not generate force in the way shallower species might require, but operate within a system where efficiency outweighs strength, where survival depends on maintaining stability rather than exerting dominance. At a microscopic level, the structure of its cells reveals further adaptation. Proteins that would normally lose their shape under such pressure remain stable here, supported by molecules that act as protectants, preserving their function. Membranes retain their integrity, neither becoming too rigid nor too fluid, maintaining a balance that allows cellular processes to continue uninterrupted. These internal adjustments are not visible, yet they define the limits within which the organism can exist. Outside of this environment, these same adaptations become vulnerabilities. The delicate equilibrium that supports life at depth cannot be maintained as pressure decreases. Without the surrounding force to match its internal state, the body begins to lose coherence. Structures that depend on compression no longer held in place. What allows the snailfish to exist here prevents it from surviving elsewhere, binding it entirely to this region of the ocean. Its presence is not isolated. Repeated observations confirm that these fish inhabit depths once considered beyond the reach of vertebrate life, extending the known boundaries of where complex organisms can persist. Each sighting adds to a growing understanding that the trench is not defined by absence, but by forms that have adapted in ways that remain specific to its conditions. In this way, the hadal snailfish becomes less a curiosity and more a reflection of the environment itself, a living expression of pressure, darkness, and isolation. It does not resist these factors, but incorporates them, existing as part of a system that supports it fully only within this narrow range of conditions. Its form, its movement, and its limitations all align with a world that does not accommodate variation beyond its bounds, shaping life into configurations that remain inseparable from the depth in which they are found. Nothing here begins with light. Energy arrives by other means, carried not by illumination but by chemistry and slow descent. In this depth, The absence of sunlight does not leave a void, but establishes a different foundation, one where life draws from sources that remain hidden from the surface. The familiar process that fuels most ecosystems above, driven by photosynthesis, has no place here, replaced by pathways that depend on transformation rather than capture. Across the seafloor, energy circulates through reactions that occur quietly within sediment and water. Chemical compounds, released from the earth itself or altered through microbial activity, provide a steady but limited supply. Certain organisms draw directly from these reactions, converting inorganic substances into usable energy through processes that function without light. This form of chemosynthesis sustains life at its most fundamental level, creating a base upon which other organisms can exist. At the same time, a slow and continuous descent connects this environment to the distant surface. Organic material produced far above begins a gradual journey downward. Particles drift through the water column over long periods, forming what is often described as marine snow, though its movement is less visible than its name suggests. These fragments include the remains of microscopic organisms, waste from larger creatures, and occasional larger bodies that settle after death. By the time they reach the depths, much has been consumed or broken apart, yet enough remains to support those adapted to scarcity. Life here does not depend on abundance, but on efficiency. Organisms utilize what arrives with precision, extracting energy from limited resources and often enduring long intervals between feeding opportunities. This creates a system where consumption is measured and survival is shaped by the ability to persist through periods of minimal intake. Interactions between species form a network that reflects this balance, where each level of the food chain is closely tied to both chemical processes and the slow arrival of organic matter. Predation still exists, though it unfolds differently. Movements are less frequent, encounters less immediate, and energy expenditure carefully controlled. Some organisms feed directly on the sediment, ingesting material that contains both chemical nutrients and organic remnants. Others consume smaller creatures, maintaining a chain of transfer that remains intact despite the absence of light. Each interaction contributes to a cycle that continues without the need for solar input, sustained instead by the combination of internal Earth processes and distant biological production. This structure represents a version of an ecosystem that operates under entirely different constraints. The absence of sunlight does not simplify life, but reshapes it, leading to relationships and strategies that diverge from those found in illuminated environments. Energy moves more slowly, transformations occur over extended periods, and the boundaries between living and non-living processes become less distinct as chemistry and biology intertwine. In this setting, life maintains continuity not through rapid growth or constant renewal, but through endurance and adaptation. The system remains stable because it aligns with the conditions that define it, drawing from sources that are consistent, even if limited. What emerges is not a diminished ecosystem, but one that reflects a different balance, where existence is sustained through pathways that extend beyond the reach of light, grounded in processes that remain steady, even in complete darkness, beneath the visible surface of the seafloor, where even the faint disturbances of passing organisms no longer reach. Another layer of life persists within the sediment itself. This existence does not announce itself through movement or form, but through presence, embedded quietly between grains of mineral and organic residue. It occupies spaces that seem too confined for activity, yet within these narrow intervals, entire communities endure. The sediment is not uniform, It forms in layers, each one recording a slow accumulation of particles that have settled over time. Within these layers, microbes inhabit microscopic pockets where water, chemistry, and structure intersect. They do not rely on open space or external visibility. Instead, they exist within a matrix that provides both constraint and stability, their activity unfolding at scales that remain invisible to direct observation. These organisms do not draw from sunlight or drifting material in the way surface ecosystems might. Their energy is derived from chemical gradients that develop within the sediment, where compounds interact over extended periods. Reactions occur between minerals and dissolved substances, creating conditions that support metabolic processes independent of external input. In this environment, life does not depend on what arrives from above, but on what is already present within the Earth's structure. Movement is minimal, often reduced to subtle shifts at the cellular level. Growth occurs slowly, reproduction extending across timescales that differ from those observed in more dynamic systems. Yet, despite this reduced pace, these microbial communities remain active, maintaining processes that continue uninterrupted. Their persistence reflects an ability to operate within constraints that would limit or prevent activity in more familiar conditions. The discovery of life within these sediment layers alters the understanding of where ecosystems begin and end. The boundary between the seafloor and what lies beneath becomes less defined, revealing a continuity that extends downward rather than stopping at a visible surface. What appears to be solid ground becomes, at a smaller scale, a porous environment capable of supporting biological activity. Chemical-based ecosystems within this context operate through networks of transformation. One group of microbes alters a compound, producing byproducts that become the resources for another. This sequence continues, forming a chain of interactions that remains stable over long periods. Energy flows through these systems without the need for light or rapid exchange, sustained instead by the steady progression of chemical reactions. These findings carry implications that reach beyond the immediate environment. If life can exist within sediment under such conditions, then the range of habitable spaces expands beyond what was previously considered viable. Environments once dismissed as too isolated or resource limited begin to appear differently, not as voids, but as potential systems where life may persist in altered forms. The trench, already removed from familiar experience, extends further into this hidden dimension where life is not only present on the seafloor, but integrated into its structure. Each layer of sediment becomes both a record of the past and a habitat in the present, supporting organisms that operate within a framework defined by chemistry and time. In this setting, life does not depend on visibility or motion to assert its presence. It remains embedded, continuous, and sustained by processes that unfold quietly within the Earth itself, extending the concept of an ecosystem into regions that remain entirely out of sight. Stillness here is only an appearance, something suggested by distance rather than confirmed by observation. When attention settles closer to the seafloor, subtle motion begins to reveal itself, not through rapid change, but through gradual shifts that unfold across long stretches of time. Fine particles do not remain fixed. They lift, drift, and resettle, forming slow-moving clouds that pass over the terrain in patterns that seem almost deliberate. These sediment clouds emerge without clear boundaries, expanding outward as currents move along the contours of the trench. Their movement is not chaotic, but guided by the shape of the seafloor itself, following slopes and depressions that channel their flow. As they travel, They carry fragments of organic and mineral material, redistributing them across different regions, altering the composition of the surface layer in ways that are subtle but continuous. What appears unchanged at first glance is, in reality, in constant adjustment. Occasionally, this motion becomes more pronounced. Sections of the seafloor shift with greater intensity as accumulated material loses stability and begins to move downslope. These underwater landslides do not occur with the sudden violence associated with surface events, but unfold with a heavy, controlled descent, displacing sediment in broad, sweeping movements. The terrain reshapes itself through these processes, smoothing some areas while building others, creating a landscape that evolves over time without visible markers of its transformation. Beyond these physical movements, the trench carries sound in a manner that differs from the world above. Low frequency vibrations travel through the dense water and underlying structures, extending across vast distances with minimal loss of energy. These sounds are not sharp or distinct, but continuous, forming a background presence that reflects both geological activity and distant disturbances. Shifts in tectonic plates, the gradual settling of sediment, and movements far removed from immediate observation all contribute to this quiet transmission. The interaction between water, sediment, and the earth beneath creates a system that is far from static. Pressure does not simply compress, it influences how materials behave, how they settle, and how they respond to movement. The trench becomes a space where forces accumulate and release in measured ways, shaping the environment through processes that operate beyond direct perception. Each adjustment, whether a drifting cloud or a shifting slope, contributes to a landscape that is continually redefining itself. Life within this environment exists alongside these changes, adapting to conditions that are neither fixed nor predictable. Organisms encounter surfaces that may alter over time, currents that shift direction, and substrates that change in composition. These factors become part of the conditions to which life responds, integrating geological activity into the broader system that supports it. What emerges is a view of the deep ocean that contrasts with earlier assumptions of stillness. The trench is not silent in its processes, nor inactive in its structure. It moves, reshapes, and transmits energy in ways that remain largely unseen, yet consistently present. The absence of visible disturbance does not indicate inactivity, but reflects the scale at which these processes occur, unfolding gradually within a space that continues to evolve beneath the weight of the ocean above. Time does not pass here in the way it does above, because nothing marks its movement. There is no transition between brightness and shadow, no gradual shift that signals the beginning or end of a cycle. Instead, the environment remains constant, a continuous state where darkness is not an absence, but a defining condition that never changes. Beyond a certain depth, this permanence settles fully into place. Light from the surface no longer reaches even in its weakest form, and nothing replaces it. The distinction between day and night disappears entirely, leaving no external rhythm to guide behavior or perception. Organisms that exist within this space do not orient themselves to cycles of illumination, but to other patterns, ones that emerge from the environment itself rather than from above. In this setting, vision becomes less central. Structures that would normally rely on detecting light are reduced, altered, or absent altogether. Eyes, where present, may remain simple or limited, offering little more than the ability to sense faint differences in brightness when artificial illumination appears. For many organisms, Even this minimal function holds little relevance as their existence unfolds within a field where visual information provides no consistent advantage. Other sensory systems take precedence, developing in ways that align with the conditions of this depth. Mechanical sensitivity becomes more refined, allowing organisms to detect subtle disturbances in the surrounding water. Vibrations travel efficiently through this dense medium, carrying information about movement, presence, and interaction. Through these signals, organisms perceive their environment not through sight, but through touch extended across space. Chemical sensing also plays a central role. Gradients of dissolved substances form patterns that can be followed, guiding organisms toward resources or away from unfavorable conditions. These chemical cues do not appear as discrete signals, but as continuous variations, requiring sensitivity that can detect minute differences. Through this process, the environment becomes legible in a different way, translated into information that can be interpreted without reliance on light. Some organisms generate their own illumination not as a replacement for the sun, but as a localized adaptation. Bioluminescence appears in brief flashes or sustained glows used for communication, attraction, or navigation. These emissions do not restore a broader sense of visibility, but create small, temporary points of reference within the surrounding darkness. Each instance of light is controlled, specific, and often limited in duration, existing as part of an interaction rather than as a constant feature. The absence of external illumination shapes behavior as well. Movement becomes measured, interactions more deliberate, and energy use carefully balanced. Without visual cues, organisms rely on proximity and detection through other means, creating a system where encounters are governed by signals that operate beyond sight. This alters not only how organisms perceive their surroundings, but how they engage with one another, forming relationships that depend on senses adapted to a world without light. Within this environment, darkness is not something that needs to be overcome. It is a stable condition that defines the parameters of existence, shaping both form and function. Life does not attempt to recreate the conditions of the surface, but instead develops within this constant state, finding ways to interpret and respond to a world that remains unseen, yet fully present in every other aspect. Pressure here is not an external force that arrives and recedes, but a constant condition that surrounds and defines every form of existence. It does not fluctuate with time or movement, and there is no relief from its presence. For life to persist within this environment, it cannot resist this force in the way rigid structures might attempt. Instead, it must align with it, incorporating the surrounding pressure into its own internal balance. At the level of the cell, this alignment begins with flexibility. Membranes that enclose cellular structures remain neither too rigid nor too fluid, maintaining a precise consistency that allows them to function under compression. Their composition differs subtly from those found in shallower environments, containing lipid arrangements that prevent collapse while still permitting the exchange of materials. This balance ensures that essential processes, such as nutrient transport and waste removal, continue without interruption. Within these cells, proteins retain their shape through the presence of specialized molecules that stabilize their structure. Under immense pressure, proteins would normally begin to unfold, losing the configurations necessary for their function. Here, compounds such as piezolites act as molecular supports, surrounding these proteins and preserving their form. This allows enzymatic reactions to proceed, maintaining the biochemical pathways that sustain life, even under conditions that would otherwise disrupt them. Equally important is what these organisms lack: air pockets, which might provide buoyancy or structural support in other environments, are absent. Any enclosed space containing gas would compress rapidly, leading to structural failure. By eliminating these features entirely, deep sea organisms avoid a vulnerability that cannot be managed at such depths. Their bodies are instead composed of materials that maintain consistent density, ensuring that internal and external pressures remain in equilibrium. This equilibrium extends throughout the organism. Tissues do not rely on hardness or resistance, but on a distribution of forces that prevents any single point from bearing excessive stress. Fluids within the body match the surrounding pressure, creating a state where there is no imbalance to correct. Movement, growth, and interaction all occur within this framework, each process adapted to function without disrupting the stability that pressure demands. These adaptations did not emerge suddenly. They are the result of long evolutionary processes unfolding over millions of years as species gradually adjusted to deeper and more demanding environments. Each generation introduced slight variations, some of which allowed for greater tolerance to pressure. Over time, these changes accumulated, producing organisms capable of existing within conditions that would be immediately destructive to those without such history. The outcome is not a single solution, but a range of strategies that share a common principle. Life here persists by becoming inseparable from its environment, removing distinctions between internal and external forces. The pressure that surrounds these organisms is not something they endure, but something they incorporate, shaping their structure and function in ways that maintain continuity. In this way, the environment does not impose a barrier, but establishes a framework within which life operates. The crushing force that defines this depth becomes part of the system that supports it, guiding the development of forms that remain stable, not in spite of pressure, but because of it. Form, at this depth, is not guided by appearance in the way it is closer to the surface, but by necessity that unfolds slowly over time. What emerges from these conditions does not resemble the structures most often associated with animals, and the difference is not accidental. Each shape reflects a long process of adjustment, where survival has gradually refined the body into something that aligns with its surroundings rather than standing apart from them. Many of these organisms possess a softness that seems unusual at first observation. Their bodies do not hold sharp outlines or firm contours, but instead appear pliable, almost suspended between solidity and fluid. This quality allows them to exist within an environment where resistance would create strain and where yielding offers stability. The tissues adapt to external forces by distributing them evenly, preventing damage that would occur if rigidity were present. In this way, the absence of firmness becomes an advantage, allowing the organism to persist without conflict against its environment. The lack of rigid bones follows the same principle. Structural frameworks that rely on hardness introduce points of stress, places where pressure could concentrate and lead to failure. By minimizing or entirely removing such elements, these creatures maintain internal consistency, avoiding the vulnerabilities that more solid forms would encounter. Support is instead provided through a balance of internal fluids and flexible materials, creating a structure that remains intact through equilibrium rather than reinforcement. Energy use also shapes their appearance. In an environment where resources arrive slowly and unpredictably, efficiency becomes central to survival. Musculature is reduced, movements are deliberate, and unnecessary features gradually diminish over generations. The result is a form that appears simplified, though this simplicity reflects a precise calibration rather than a lack of development. Each component remains, because it serves a function that cannot be removed without consequence. This economy of energy influences how these organisms interact with their surroundings. Movement is measured and infrequent, with long periods of stillness that conserve resources. Feeding strategies align with availability, and growth proceeds at a pace that matches the environment's constraints. These patterns shape not only behavior, but the physical structure itself, reinforcing forms that support endurance over rapid response. What might appear unfamiliar is, in many ways, a departure from expectations shaped by more dynamic environments. Surface life often favors speed, strength, and visibility, leading to forms that reflect competition and constant change. Here, the priorities differ. Survival depends on maintaining balance, reducing expenditure, and aligning closely with the conditions that define the space. As a result, appearance becomes secondary to function, and form follows pathways that diverge from those seen elsewhere. Over time, these adaptations accumulate, producing organisms that seem distant from familiar references. Yet they remain consistent with the same underlying biological principles, expressed through configurations that suit their environment. Their unfamiliarity arises not from exception, but from specialization, each feature shaped by the demands of a world where pressure, darkness, and limited resources guide every aspect of existence. In this context, the way these creatures look is not arbitrary. It is the visible outcome of a continuous process where each generation refines what came before, aligning structure with survival in a setting that allows no excess and no inefficiency. What becomes noticeable over time is not absence, but variation, a pattern where some stretches of the seafloor appear nearly empty, while others gather signs of life in quiet concentration. The distribution is uneven, shaped by conditions that are not immediately visible yet consistently present. In certain areas, movement, interaction, and presence accumulate, forming regions where life exists in greater density than expected for such an environment. These clusters do not arise randomly. Subtle differences in terrain, chemistry, and material accumulation influence where organisms settle and persist. Slight depressions in the seafloor can collect organic particles that drift downward over long periods, creating localized zones where resources become more accessible. Along these areas, activity increases, not through rapid motion, but through the steady presence of multiple organisms occupying the same space. In contrast, other regions remain sparsely populated. There, the same environmental conditions limit the availability of resources, and life appears only occasionally, moving through rather than remaining. This contrast creates a landscape that is not uniform, but structured through gradients, where abundance and scarcity exist side by side, each defining the other through their difference. As repeated observations accumulate, the notion of a barren trench begins to dissolve. Instead, a more complex picture emerges, where life is present in quantities that exceed earlier assumptions, though not distributed evenly across the entire depth. These organisms are not isolated anomalies, but parts of localized systems that function within specific conditions, forming networks that are often hidden from broader view. Within these concentrated regions, interactions become more apparent. Organisms share space, feed from the same sources, and influence the surrounding sediment through their activity. Small-scale ecosystems develop, shaped by the availability of energy and the structure of the terrain. These systems do not resemble those found in more familiar environments, yet they maintain internal relationships that support continuity and balance. The boundaries of these ecosystems are not clearly defined. They blend gradually into the surrounding areas, where density decreases and interactions become less frequent. This creates a mosaic of life, where each region contributes to the overall presence of organisms within the trench, even if some areas appear quiet by comparison. The transitions between these zones are subtle, often detectable only through careful observation over time. Hidden within this distribution are layers of complexity that extend beyond immediate visibility. Some organisms remain partially embedded within the sediment, others move intermittently, and many operate at scales that require sustained attention to detect. Together, they form systems that are not immediately apparent, yet become clearer as patterns repeat across multiple descents. This uneven abundance reflects a balance between limitation and opportunity. Resources remain scarce on a broad scale, yet within certain conditions, they gather sufficiently to support clusters of life. These concentrations do not eliminate scarcity, but create pockets where survival becomes more feasible, allowing organisms to persist in greater numbers than once imagined. In this way, the trench reveals itself not as uniformly sparse, but as a collection of environments layered within one another, each shaped by its own conditions. Life exists throughout, though not equally, forming a pattern that reflects the complexity of the forces at work beneath the ocean's surface, where even in depth, variation continues to define the presence of living systems. From far above, beyond layers that have long since lost their connection to sight, material begins a slow descent that carries traces of a distant world. It does not arrive all at once, nor in clearly defined forms, but as a continuous, delicate fall of particles that move gradually through the water column. This drifting matter, often described as marine snow, is composed of fragments that originate in environments shaped by light and motion, yet reach depths where neither remains. The journey downward is prolonged. As particles sink, they are altered by time and interaction, broken apart, consumed, and reshaped by organisms encountered along the way. By the time they approach the seafloor, what remains is reduced, yet still significant. These remnants settle across the terrain, forming a thin and uneven layer that becomes one of the primary sources of energy in this environment. Among these particles are the remains of microscopic organisms, fragments of larger bodies, and traces of biological processes that occurred far above. Occasionally, larger forms descend intact, the bodies of animals that have completed their lives in distant waters. When these arrivals reach the depths, they introduce a temporary increase in available resources, drawing the attention of organisms adapted to detect and utilize such opportunities. The timing of these arrivals is not consistent. Long intervals may pass with only minimal material reaching the seafloor, followed by periods where more substantial deposits occur. This irregularity shapes the behavior of organisms that depend on these inputs. Rather than relying on frequent feeding, they adjust to scarcity, developing strategies that allow them to endure extended periods with limited intake. Energy is conserved wherever possible. Movement is reduced, growth proceeds slowly, and metabolic rates remain low, all contributing to a system where survival depends on maintaining balance over time. When material does arrive, it is used efficiently, with little waste. Organisms feed not only on fresh deposits, but also on material that has settled previously, extracting whatever nutrients remain. Interactions form around these resources, though they do not resemble the rapid competition seen in more dynamic environments. Instead, there is a measured response where multiple organisms gather gradually, each utilizing what is available without exhausting it immediately. This shared use reflects an understanding embedded within their behavior, shaped by generations of adaptation to an environment defined by delayed supply. The descent of this material connects distant regions of the ocean in a quiet and continuous exchange. What originates in one part of the world becomes part of another, linking ecosystems that differ greatly in conditions and structure. The trench receives this input not as a constant flow, but as a sequence of arrivals separated by time, each contributing to the persistence of life below. Within this system, patience becomes a defining characteristic. Survival is not based on immediate access to resources, but on the ability to endure between arrivals, to remain stable until conditions shift. The organisms that inhabit this depth reflect this balance, their forms and behaviors aligned with a cycle that unfolds slowly, shaped by the steady, almost imperceptible fall of material from a world that exists far beyond their reach. Occasionally, the steady pattern of scarcity is interrupted by an arrival that alters the surrounding environment in a way that is both immediate and far reaching. These moments begin not with gradual accumulation, but with the descent of something large, a form that carries with it a concentrated source of energy. When such a body reaches the seafloor, it does not blend quietly into the existing system, but introduces a presence that reshapes activity in its vicinity. Among the most significant of these arrivals are the remains of large marine animals, their descent marking the end of one life and the beginning of many interactions below. When a whale carcass settles into the trench, it brings with it a mass of organic material far greater than what typically arrives through slow drifting particles. This sudden availability transforms the surrounding area, creating a focal point that draws organisms from beyond the immediate region. The response is not instantaneous, but it unfolds steadily as chemical signals disperse through the water. Organisms capable of detecting these changes begin to move toward the source, their paths guided by gradients that reveal the presence of newly available resources. As they arrive, activity increases, not through rapid motion, but through the accumulation of presence, as more individuals gather within a confined space. Feeding begins in layers. Larger scavengers access the outer portions of the carcass, while smaller organisms occupy areas that become exposed over time. Microbial communities develop alongside them, breaking down material at a level that is not visible yet essential to the process. This progression continues as the structure of the carcass changes, each stage supporting different forms of life that contribute to its gradual transformation. For a period, the area surrounding the carcass becomes a temporary ecosystem, distinct from the more dispersed patterns found elsewhere. Interactions increase, and the flow of energy becomes concentrated, allowing organisms to access resources in quantities rarely encountered at such depths. This concentration supports a diversity of activity, where feeding, movement, and interaction occur more frequently within a limited space. Competition emerges within this context, though it remains measured by the constraints of the environment. Organisms do not expend energy without purpose, and even in the presence of abundance, efficiency remains central. Access to the resource is shared across different scales, with each organism utilizing what it can within the limits of its capabilities. The carcass itself changes as it is consumed, gradually reducing in size and complexity, altering the conditions for those that remain. Over time, the system begins to shift again. As the available material diminishes, activity decreases, and the concentrated ecosystem disperses. What remains are traces of what occurred: altered sediment, residual compounds, and the continuation of microbial processes that persist even after the larger structure has been consumed. The environment returns to its broader pattern, shaped once more by scarcity and gradual input. These events, though infrequent, play a significant role in the overall system. They introduce moments of concentrated energy that support life in ways not possible through steady but limited supply. Each occurrence becomes part of a larger cycle, contributing to the persistence of organisms that rely on both the slow fall of material and the rare arrival of abundance, woven together within a system defined by time and adaptation. Even in a place defined by distance and isolation, traces of the surface find their way downward, carried slowly through pathways that remain largely unseen. Among these traces are particles that do not belong to any natural cycle of this environment, materials formed elsewhere that arrive without intention. Within the sediment, mixed among mineral grains and organic remnants, small fragments of plastic have been detected, their presence subtle yet unmistakable. These particles are not uniform. They vary in size, shape, and composition, some reduced to microscopic scales through prolonged exposure to physical and chemical processes. Their descent follows the same gradual pathways as other materials, moving through the water column over extended periods. Along the way, they are altered, broken down into smaller fragments, yet they do not fully disappear. Instead, they persist, accumulating within layers of sediment that record their arrival over time. Once settled, these particles become part of the environment, integrated into the same spaces occupied by microorganisms and other forms of life. They do not remain separate, but interact with their surroundings, absorbing compounds and providing surfaces upon which biological processes can occur. Their presence is passive in appearance, yet their influence extends into systems that rely on delicate balances. Within the bodies of deep-sea organisms, these materials have also been identified. Small fragments are ingested, along with sediment or organic matter, entering biological systems that were not shaped to process them. Inside these organisms, the particles remain, moving through digestive pathways or becoming lodged within tissues. Their presence does not always produce immediate or visible effects, yet it introduces an element that did not exist in earlier conditions. This incorporation reflects a connection between distant environments. Materials produced at the surface, often through human activity, travel across vast distances and eventually reach depths once considered entirely separate. The trench, despite its remoteness, becomes part of a broader system that links surface processes with the most inaccessible regions of the ocean. The implications of this presence unfold gradually. Unlike larger disturbances, these particles do not alter the environment through sudden change, but through accumulation. Each fragment contributes to a shift that is subtle yet continuous, becoming part of the sedimentary record and the biological systems that interact with it. Over time, this accumulation reflects patterns of activity far removed from the trench itself. There is no immediate transformation of the environment that marks this change. Instead, it becomes apparent through careful observation, through the detection of materials that originate from beyond the natural processes of the deep ocean. Their presence introduces a layer of complexity that intersects with existing systems, adding elements that were not part of the original conditions under which these organisms evolved. In this way, the trench reflects not only its own processes, but those occurring far above. The arrival of these particles reveals a continuity that extends across the entire ocean, connecting regions that differ greatly in form and function. What was once considered isolated now appears linked, with materials moving across scales and depths that challenge earlier assumptions of separation. Within this quiet integration, a realization emerges, not through dramatic change, but through the recognition of connection. The deepest parts of the ocean, though distant and rarely observed, remain influenced by actions that originate far beyond their boundaries, becoming part of a system that extends from the surface to the most remote depths. Separation here is not defined by visible distance, but by the difficulty of movement between regions that remain physically connected yet functionally apart. The trench forms a series of isolated pockets shaped by depth, terrain, and conditions that limit the exchange of life between them. Within these pockets, organisms persist with little interaction beyond their immediate surroundings, their existence unfolding within boundaries that are rarely crossed. This limited connectivity influences how species develop over time. With fewer opportunities for individuals to move between populations, genetic exchange becomes restricted. Variations that arise within one group remain largely contained, allowing them to accumulate and shape the characteristics of that population in distinct ways. Over extended periods, these differences grow more pronounced, leading to the emergence of species that exist only within specific regions of the trench. Such species are not widespread, nor do they exhibit the broad distribution seen in more accessible environments. Their presence is tied closely to the conditions in which they evolved, conditions that may not be replicated elsewhere. As a result, they remain confined, their adaptations finely tuned to a narrow set of parameters that define their survival. This specialization reinforces their isolation, as the very traits that allow them to exist here limit their ability to move beyond it. The process of evolution within this setting unfolds at a pace shaped by stability rather than rapid change. Environmental conditions, though extreme, remain relatively consistent over long periods. This consistency allows gradual adjustments to take hold, with each generation refining the traits that support survival. Changes do not occur abruptly, but accumulate slowly, guided by subtle pressures that influence which variations persist. Adaptations become highly specific. Structures, behaviors, and physiological processes align closely with the environment, leaving little room for unnecessary features. Energy use remains efficient. Responses to external changes are measured, and survival depends on maintaining a balance that reflects the conditions of the trench. Over time, this leads to forms that differ significantly from those found elsewhere, not through dramatic divergence, but through continuous refinement. Isolation also reduces competition from outside species, allowing these organisms to occupy ecological roles without interference from broader populations. This creates systems that are self-contained, where interactions occur primarily among species that have co-evolved within the same environment. Relationships develop in parallel, each influenced by the same constraints, resulting in networks that reflect a shared history of adaptation. Despite this separation, the underlying processes remain consistent with those observed throughout life on Earth. Mutation, selection, and inheritance continue to operate, shaping organisms in response to their surroundings. What differs is the context in which these processes unfold, where limited exchange and stable conditions guide evolution along paths that remain closely tied to the environment. In this way, the trench becomes a collection of distinct evolutionary pathways, each defined by its own constraints and possibilities. Species found here represent outcomes that have developed in relative isolation, their forms and functions reflecting a long history of adaptation within confined spaces. Their uniqueness does not arise from exception, but from continuity, shaped over time by the absence of connection and the presence of conditions that remain largely unchanged. Nothing here unfolds quickly, not in movement, not in growth, not in the passage of life itself. Processes extend across long intervals, shaped by conditions where energy is limited and must be used with care. The environment does not support urgency, and in response, life adjusts its rhythm, settling into a pace that aligns with what is available rather than what might be desired. Metabolism reflects this constraint. Chemical processes within organisms proceed at reduced rates, conserving energy while maintaining essential functions. There is no surplus to draw from, no abundance that allows for rapid consumption or frequent activity. Instead, each process is calibrated to operate within narrow margins, sustaining life through continuity rather than intensity. The internal systems of these organisms are not inactive, but they move with a steadiness that mirrors the environment itself. Movement follows a similar pattern. Organisms do not travel far or often, and when they do, their motions remain controlled and deliberate. Sudden bursts of speed would require energy that cannot be easily replaced, making such actions rare. Instead, position is maintained whenever possible, with adjustments made only when necessary. This approach reduces expenditure, allowing organisms to persist through periods when resources are not immediately accessible. Survival strategies extend beyond individual behavior into the structure of life cycles. Growth is gradual, development unfolds over extended periods, and reproduction occurs in ways that reflect the scarcity of resources. Some organisms may live for long durations, their lifespans stretching beyond what might be expected in more dynamic environments. This longevity allows them to endure fluctuations, maintaining presence even when conditions vary. Efficiency becomes the guiding principle. Every aspect of structure and function contributes to reducing unnecessary energy use. Features that do not directly support survival tend to diminish over time, leaving forms that appear minimal yet remain fully adapted to their surroundings. This refinement is not a loss, but an adjustment, aligning each organism more closely with the constraints that define its existence. Interactions between organisms also reflect this measured pace. Encounters are infrequent, and relationships develop slowly, shaped by proximity and opportunity rather than constant competition. The exchange of energy, whether through feeding or other processes, occurs within a framework that prioritizes balance. There is little excess and little waste, as each interaction contributes to maintaining stability within the system. Time, in this context, takes on a different quality. Without rapid change or frequent disturbance, it becomes something that accumulates quietly, marked by gradual shifts rather than clear transitions. The environment supports continuity, allowing life to persist through adaptation that unfolds over long durations. Each organism exists within this extended framework, its presence defined by endurance rather than immediacy. In this way, the pace of life is not a limitation, but a reflection of the conditions that sustain it. Speed offers no advantage where resources remain scarce and change occurs slowly. Instead, persistence becomes the defining trait, supported by systems that favor conservation and stability. Life continues, not through rapid expansion, but through a steady alignment with the environment, where efficiency ensures survival across spans of time that extend far beyond brief moments of activity. What appears settled is, in reality, in continuous transition, shaped by forces that operate beneath the surface and beyond immediate perception. The seafloor does not remain fixed in its form, but adjusts gradually, its structure influenced by movements that unfold over extended periods. These changes do not present themselves through sudden transformation, but through a slow reconfiguration that alters the landscape in subtle and persistent ways. Beneath the sediment, Tectonic forces guide the broader structure of the trench. Plates shift against one another, their motion measured in increments that are almost imperceptible in the moment, yet significant across time. This movement defines the depth and shape of the environment, creating slopes, ridges, and depressions that continue to evolve. The trench itself is a product of this interaction, formed through processes that remain active, shaping its contours even now. At the surface of the seafloor, these deeper forces manifest through the gradual redistribution of material. Sediment does not remain where it settles, but is influenced by currents, gravity, and the underlying terrain. Particles shift position, accumulating in some areas while thinning in others, creating patterns that reflect the movement of both water and earth. Over time, these adjustments alter the texture and composition of the seafloor, forming a surface that is never entirely stable. In certain regions, this redistribution becomes more pronounced. Slopes adjust as material moves downward, filling lower areas and reshaping the terrain. The process is not abrupt, but it carries a sense of direction, guided by the contours that define the trench. As sediment relocates, it carries with it traces of biological and chemical processes, redistributing not only material, but also the conditions that support life. This constant change influences the organisms that inhabit the seafloor. Habitats shift gradually, requiring adaptation to conditions that evolve over time. Areas that once supported certain forms of life may alter in composition, while new regions become suitable for occupation. These transitions occur without clear boundaries, creating a landscape where stability exists alongside continuous adjustment. The interaction between geological movement and sediment redistribution creates a system that remains active even in the absence of visible disturbance. Forces from within the earth shape the broader structure, while surface processes refine its details. Together, they produce an environment that evolves steadily, its form defined by both deep and surface level interactions. Time plays a central role in this transformation. Changes accumulate slowly, each adjustment building upon those that came before. The landscape reflects this history, with layers of sediment and shifts in terrain recording the passage of processes that extend far beyond immediate observation. What is seen at any given moment represents only a point within a much longer sequence of change. In this way, the seafloor exists as a dynamic system, shaped by forces that remain active even in the deepest regions. It is not a static foundation, but a surface that responds continuously to the interactions of earth and ocean. Each movement, each redistribution of material contributes to a landscape that remains in motion, evolving quietly beneath the weight of the water above. Maps suggest form, but here they offer only a faint outline, a suggestion of depth without detail. The trench extends far beyond the portions that have been directly observed, its full extent remaining largely unexamined. What has been seen represents only a small fraction of its total area, a series of brief encounters within a space that continues outward in directions rarely reached. Each descent provides a narrow view, limited by time, equipment, and the constraints of operating in such an environment. The area illuminated during any single exploration is small, defined by the reach of instruments and the duration of the mission. Beyond that, the seafloor continues uninterrupted, extending into regions that remain unvisited, their characteristics inferred rather than confirmed. This limitation is not due to a lack of interest, but to the difficulty of access. Reaching these depths requires specialized technology capable of withstanding extreme conditions, and even then, each mission must operate within strict boundaries. The construction and deployment of such systems involve precision and care, leaving little room for frequent or expansive coverage. As a result, exploration progresses gradually, each mission adding a small portion to the overall understanding. The scale of the trench further complicates this effort. Its dimensions exceed what can be easily surveyed, and its terrain varies in ways that are not fully predictable. Slopes, depressions, and structures extend across distances that require extensive time to traverse, making comprehensive observation a challenge. Even with advanced tools, capturing a complete picture remains beyond current capabilities. Data collected from these missions provides valuable insights, yet it also highlights the extent of what remains unknown. Patterns observed in one area may not apply elsewhere, and conditions can shift across relatively short distances. This variability suggests a complexity that cannot be fully understood through limited sampling, requiring repeated exploration across multiple regions. Technological limitations also shape what can be recorded. Instruments must balance durability with sensitivity, capturing information while enduring conditions that test their design. Communication with the surface remains constrained, and the volume of data that can be transmitted or stored during a mission is finite. These factors influence not only where exploration can occur, but how much detail can be retained from each encounter. As a result, much of the trench exists as an extension of possibility rather than confirmed observation. It is not empty of information, but filled with areas that have yet to be directly examined. The known portions provide glimpses, fragments that hint at broader patterns, yet leave significant gaps in understanding. This imbalance between what has been seen and what remains unexplored defines the current relationship with the trench. Each discovery adds clarity, yet also emphasizes the scale of what lies beyond reach. The environment continues in all directions, its full extent remaining largely outside direct experience. In this way, the trench is understood not as a fully mapped space, but as a region where knowledge is partial and expanding. Exploration proceeds through careful steps, each one extending the boundary of what is known, while leaving vast areas still unobserved, their details waiting beyond the limits of current exploration. Before any descent begins, the challenge is already present, embedded within the design of the vessel itself. To reach these depths, engineering must account for conditions that exceed ordinary limits, where external forces remain constant and unforgiving. Materials are selected not only for strength, but for how they distribute stress, forming structures that can endure immense compression without fracture. The hull becomes a boundary that must remain intact under pressure that increases with every meter, leaving no tolerance for weakness or imbalance. Within this boundary, every system must function reliably, despite the environment that surrounds it. Mechanical components are sealed and reinforced. Electronics are protected against conditions that could disrupt their operation, and life support systems must sustain a stable, internal environment throughout the duration of the mission. Each element depends on the others, forming an interconnected system where failure in one part can affect the whole. The complexity of this design reflects the necessity of precision, as even minor imperfections can become significant at such depths. Navigation introduces another layer of difficulty. Without familiar reference points, movement through the trench relies on instruments that interpret position and orientation in relation to the seafloor. The terrain is uneven and varied, requiring careful adjustment to avoid contact with slopes or structures that may not be fully mapped. Progress is measured and deliberate, guided by data rather than direct visual cues, as the surrounding environment offers little in the way of consistent landmarks. Communication with the surface remains limited by the properties of the medium itself. Signals travel slowly through water, and the amount of information that can be transmitted is constrained. Messages are exchanged with delay, and real time coordination becomes difficult, requiring the crew to operate with a degree of independence. The connection to the surface persists, yet it does not provide immediate feedback, reinforcing the separation between the vessel and those monitoring from above. These constraints shape how each mission unfolds. Time is carefully managed, with descent, observation, and ascent all planned within narrow margins. The duration of exposure to extreme conditions must be controlled, and every action is considered in relation to the resources available. There is little room for improvisation, as the environment does not permit extended uncertainty. Risk remains a constant presence, though it is addressed through preparation rather than confrontation. The potential for failure exists in every aspect of the journey, from structural integrity to system reliability. Engineers and operators account for these possibilities through design, testing, and procedural control, reducing the likelihood of failure without eliminating it entirely. The environment imposes limits that cannot be fully removed, only managed. Exploration at these depths, therefore, becomes a balance between capability and constraint. Each descent represents a convergence of engineering, planning, and execution, all aligned toward maintaining stability within an unstable context. Progress is achieved not through speed or expansion, but through careful extension of what is possible, step by step. In this way, the act of reaching the trench is shaped as much by limitation as by intention. The environment defines the terms, and exploration proceeds within those boundaries, guided by systems that must remain precise and resilient, sustaining human presence in a place where even small deviations can carry significant consequences. Inside the vessel, space becomes defined by function rather than comfort, each surface arranged with purpose, each system positioned within reach. The interior remains steady, insulated from the immense forces outside, creating an environment that feels contained and controlled. Yet this stability exists in contrast to what surrounds it, a narrow boundary separating human presence from conditions that cannot be directly experienced without protection. As the descent continues, time stretches into a sequence of measured intervals. There are no external changes to mark progress, no shifting horizon or passing reference points, only the gradual update of instruments that indicate depth and position. The duration of the journey becomes a central aspect of the experience, with hours unfolding in a space where movement is minimal and attention remains focused on the systems that sustain the mission. Isolation develops gradually rather than abruptly. Communication with the surface continues, but its rhythm is altered, shaped by delays that create distance even when connection remains. Responses arrive after intervals that lengthen perception, and exchanges take on a different cadence, reinforcing the sense that the vessel operates within its own enclosed context. The surface persists as a point of reference, yet it becomes less immediate, existing beyond the reach of direct interaction. Outside the hull, darkness remains constant, uninterrupted by any external source of light. This absence does not fluctuate or shift, but surrounds the vessel entirely, extending in all directions without variation. Illumination exists only through the systems carried within, casting limited visibility into an environment that does not reveal itself fully. Beyond that reach, the surroundings remain undefined, present yet unseen. Dependence on technology becomes absolute. Every aspect of survival is maintained through systems that regulate pressure, provide breathable air, control temperature, and monitor the integrity of the vessel. These systems operate continuously, requiring oversight and trust as their function cannot be replaced by any external support at this depth. The boundary they maintain is precise, holding internal conditions steady while the external environment remains unchanged in its intensity. Awareness of what lies beyond the hull does not come through direct sensation, but through understanding. Instruments translate pressure, depth, and movement into information that can be interpreted, offering a representation of conditions that cannot be physically felt. This awareness exists as knowledge rather than experience, a recognition of forces and distances that remain abstract yet constantly present. The mind adapts to this environment by aligning with its constraints. Attention shifts toward internal processes, toward the monitoring of systems and the interpretation of data. External references diminish, replaced by a focus on maintaining continuity within the vessel. The environment outside remains part of the experience, though it is encountered through indirect means, shaping perception without direct contact. In this setting, the journey becomes defined not only by movement through space, but by the maintenance of stability within a controlled boundary. Human presence persists through the integration of technology and awareness, sustained within a structure that allows existence in a place otherwise inaccessible. The experience unfolds quietly, shaped by isolation, reliance, and the continuous presence of an environment that remains just beyond reach. Return, in this context, is not driven by completion, but by the recognition that each encounter reveals only a portion of what exists. No single descent provides a full account, and what is observed in one moment does not remain fixed in the next. The trench does not present itself all at once, and so understanding develops through repetition, through the act of going back and seeing again under slightly different conditions. Scientific curiosity forms the initial movement toward this repetition, though it does not remain abstract for long. Observations gathered from earlier descents suggest patterns that require confirmation, details that invite closer examination, and variations that cannot be explained without further presence. Each recorded moment becomes part of a larger sequence, one that can only be extended through continued exploration. The desire to understand does not resolve into a single answer, but expands as new information is added. Repeated observations serve a purpose beyond verification. They reveal change, subtle adjustments that occur over time within an environment that might otherwise appear constant. Differences in sediment distribution, variations in biological activity, and shifts in chemical composition emerge only when compared across multiple visits. Without this repetition, these changes remain unnoticed, their significance lost within isolated observations. Time becomes an essential factor in this process. The trench operates on scales that do not align with brief encounters, and so understanding requires attention that extends across longer intervals. By returning, researchers can track the progression of processes that unfold slowly, building a record that reflects continuity rather than isolated events. Each descent adds another layer to this record, contributing to a view that grows more detailed with accumulation. The expansion of knowledge follows this gradual pattern. Insights do not arrive fully formed, but develop through the integration of many small observations. What was once uncertain becomes clearer, while new uncertainties emerge alongside it. This balance between what is known and what remains open continues to shift, guided by the steady addition of information gathered over time. Technology supports this progression, enabling repeated access to depths that would otherwise remain beyond reach. Improvements in design and capability allow for more precise measurements, longer durations of observation, and a broader range of data collection. Each advancement extends the potential for understanding, though it does not eliminate the need for continued presence. The environment requires not only better tools, but also persistence in their use. There is also a continuity in the act of returning itself. Each mission builds upon those that came before, informed by previous findings and guided by questions that have developed over time. This continuity ensures that exploration remains connected, forming a sequence rather than a series of isolated efforts. The trench is approached not as a place to be visited once, but as a system to be studied through ongoing engagement. In this way, returning becomes part of the method, an essential component of how understanding is formed. Knowledge does not emerge from a single descent, but from the accumulation of many, each one contributing to a broader picture that continues to evolve. The process remains open, shaped by curiosity, sustained by repetition, and extended through time as the trench reveals itself gradually to those who continue to return. Understanding begins to shift not through a single discovery, but through the accumulation of many observations that no longer fit within earlier assumptions. What was once considered a boundary becomes less certain as evidence continues to extend beyond it. The trench, in revealing forms of life adapted to conditions once thought uninhabitable, alters the framework through which life on Earth is understood. Limits that once appeared fixed begin to open. Depth, pressure, absence of light, and scarcity of energy were previously seen as defining edges, places where biological processes could not persist in complex forms. Yet within this environment, life does not merely endure. It organizes, adapts, and continues across scales that challenge those earlier definitions. The presence of organisms here suggests that what defines habitability is not confined to narrow conditions, but is broader and more flexible than once believed. This adjustment extends to the concept of where life can exist. Habitable environments are no longer limited to regions that resemble the surface, where light, moderate pressure, and abundant energy create familiar conditions. Instead, habitability becomes a matter of adaptation, where organisms develop structures and processes that align with the specific constraints of their surroundings. The trench represents one expression of this principle, where life persists through alignment rather than resistance. Biological understanding expands alongside this shift. The mechanisms that allow organisms to function under extreme pressure, to derive energy without sunlight, and to maintain stability within isolated systems provide insights into the range of possibilities within life itself. These adaptations are not anomalies, but variations within a broader biological framework, demonstrating how life can reorganize its processes to suit different environments. As these insights accumulate, they influence how other environments are considered. Regions once dismissed as unsuitable for life, whether on Earth or elsewhere, begin to be re-examined in light of these findings. The criteria used to assess habitability become less restrictive, incorporating a wider range of conditions under which life might exist. This does not simplify the search for life, but broadens it, allowing for possibilities that extend beyond earlier expectations. The trench contributes to this broader perspective by providing a direct example of life operating under conditions that diverge significantly from those at the surface. Each observation adds detail to this example, refining the understanding of how biological systems can adapt. The focus shifts from identifying limits to exploring variations, from defining boundaries to understanding how they can be extended. This evolving understanding remains grounded in continuity. The processes observed here, follow the same fundamental principles that govern life elsewhere, yet they are expressed through forms that reflect the specific demands of the environment. This continuity reinforces the idea that life is not constrained by a single set of conditions, but is capable of existing across a range of environments, each with its own configuration. In this way, the discoveries made within the trench do not isolate it as an exception, but integrate it into a broader understanding of life on Earth. They reveal a system that is more adaptable and more expansive than previously recognized, where the boundaries of possibility continue to shift as new observations are made, extending the scope of what life can be and where it can exist. Far from this depth, beyond the boundaries of Earth, there are environments that share certain similarities with what exists here, not in appearance, but in condition. Worlds without sunlight at their surfaces, oceans concealed beneath layers of ice, and regions shaped by pressure and chemical interaction rather than illumination all reflect aspects that can be observed within the trench. These parallels do not suggest direct equivalence, but they offer a framework through which distant environments can be considered. The conditions encountered in the trench provide a reference point, a way of understanding how life might persist in places that differ greatly from those most familiar. The absence of sunlight, once viewed as a limiting factor, becomes less definitive when life is observed functioning entirely without it. Energy derived from chemical processes rather than light introduces a pathway that could exist elsewhere, where similar reactions may occur beneath surfaces or within subsurface oceans. Planetary science draws from these observations, integrating them into models that describe how environments beyond Earth might support life. The presence of liquid water, the availability of chemical gradients, and the stability of certain conditions over time all become factors that are evaluated in light of what is known from deep ocean systems. The trench serves as an example, demonstrating that life does not require the same inputs across all environments, but can adapt to what is available. In this context, moons such as Europa or Enceladus, with their subsurface oceans, become points of interest. Their environments, though distant and shaped by different processes, may contain conditions that parallel those found within Earth's deepest regions. Pressure, isolation, and chemical interaction define these spaces, suggesting that the principles observed in the trench could apply in altered forms beyond this planet. The relevance of these connections lies not in direct comparison, but in the expansion of possibility. Each discovery within the trench informs how scientists approach the search for life elsewhere, refining the criteria used to identify habitable environments. The focus shifts from seeking exact matches to recognizing patterns that indicate potential, even when conditions diverge from those at the surface of Earth. This perspective also influences the design of future exploration. Instruments and missions are developed with an awareness of how life might exist under extreme conditions, guided by what has been observed in deep ocean environments. The trench, though part of Earth, becomes a testing ground for ideas that extend far beyond it, shaping how exploration is conducted in distant regions. The connection between these environments remains conceptual, yet grounded in shared principles. Life, as observed here, demonstrates an ability to adapt to conditions that once appeared prohibitive, suggesting that similar adaptability could emerge elsewhere under the right circumstances. This does not confirm the presence of life beyond Earth, but it broadens the scope of where it might be found. In this way, the trench contributes to a larger understanding that extends beyond its immediate context. It provides insight into how life can exist under extreme conditions, offering a reference that informs the study of environments across the solar system and beyond. The depth explored here becomes part of a wider exploration, one that considers not only what is known, but what may exist in places still beyond reach. Nothing here is truly separate, even at this depth, where distance suggests isolation. The trench remains part of a larger system that extends across the entire ocean, linked through processes that move slowly yet continuously. These connections are not always visible, but they persist through the exchange of materials and energy that travel between layers, shaping conditions both below and above. Nutrients circulate through this system in pathways that connect distant regions. Material that descends from upper layers becomes incorporated into the seafloor, where it is transformed through biological and chemical processes. Over time, these transformations alter the composition of substances that may eventually return to higher levels, carried by currents that move across vast distances. This cycle does not occur quickly, but unfolds through sequences that extend across long timescales, linking environments that differ greatly in appearance. The trench participates in this circulation not as an endpoint, but as part of a broader exchange. Organic matter that reaches these depths contributes to the redistribution of elements such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, each playing a role in sustaining life across the ocean. Through decomposition and transformation, these elements are reintroduced into forms that can move beyond the immediate environment, continuing their progression through the system. Ocean-wide currents serve as pathways for this movement, transporting water and dissolved substances between regions. These currents operate across different depths, creating layers of circulation that interact with one another. While the trench lies at the deepest level, it remains influenced by these movements, receiving input from above and contributing to processes that extend outward. The flow is not uniform, but it maintains continuity, ensuring that no part of the ocean exists entirely in isolation. This connectivity influences surface life in ways that are not immediately apparent. The balance of nutrients available in upper layers depends in part on processes occurring far below, where material is transformed and redistributed. Changes within deep environments can, over time, affect conditions that support ecosystems closer to the surface, linking distant regions through gradual but persistent interactions. Biological processes contribute to this connection as well. Organisms that inhabit different depths participate in cycles that move energy and material between layers. Some species migrate vertically, carrying nutrients with them as they move, while others influence the composition of the water through their metabolic activity. These interactions form a network that extends beyond any single environment, integrating multiple layers into a unified system. The influence of the deep ocean remains subtle, often unfolding beyond direct observation. Its effects do not manifest through immediate change, but through the steady regulation of conditions that support life elsewhere. The trench, though distant and rarely seen, plays a role within this larger framework, contributing to cycles that sustain the ocean as a whole. In this way, the deep ocean exists not as a separate domain, but as an integral part of Earth's systems. Its processes connect with those at the surface, forming a continuous exchange that maintains balance across different environments. What occurs in these depths becomes part of a broader pattern, one that extends outward, linking the most remote regions to the more familiar, shaping life across the entire ocean. Knowledge here gathers slowly, and even as it expands, it reveals the extent of what remains beyond reach. Each descent, each recorded observation, adds clarity to certain aspects of the trench, yet at the same time, it exposes areas that remain unresolved. The more detail that is captured, the more apparent it becomes that understanding is incomplete, shaped as much by absence as by discovery. Many species remain unidentified, observed only briefly or indirectly, their forms recorded without full context. Some appear in a single descent and are not encountered again, leaving only fragments of information from which to interpret their existence. Others are seen repeatedly, yet their behaviors and roles within the ecosystem are not fully understood. Classification provides a framework, but it does not fully explain how these organisms interact with their environment or with each other. Behavior, in particular, remains difficult to interpret. Movements that seem deliberate may follow patterns that are not yet recognized, influenced by factors that are not immediately visible. Feeding strategies, reproductive processes, and interactions between species occur at a pace and scale that challenge direct observation. Without continuous monitoring, these behaviors are captured only in brief intervals, leaving gaps that must be inferred rather than directly observed. Data itself remains limited, shaped by the constraints of exploration. Each mission collects information within a restricted window of time, and while these data points accumulate, they do not yet form a complete picture. Variations between different regions of the trench suggest complexity that cannot be fully resolved through isolated observations. Patterns may emerge, but they often remain provisional, subject to revision as new information becomes available. Technological limitations contribute to these gaps. Instruments provide detailed measurements within their range, yet they cannot capture every aspect of the environment simultaneously. Some processes occur beyond the resolution of current tools, while others unfold over timescales that exceed the duration of any single mission. These limitations create boundaries within which knowledge is formed, leaving areas that remain unexamined. There are also processes that are detected but not fully explained. Chemical interactions within the sediment, subtle changes in the composition of water, and variations in biological activity suggest underlying mechanisms that have yet to be fully understood. These observations point towards systems that operate with a level of complexity that extends beyond current models, requiring further study to interpret. The trench, in this sense, remains an environment defined by both presence and uncertainty. What has been observed provides a foundation, yet it does not complete the picture. Each answer leads to further considerations, expanding the scope of inquiry rather than resolving it entirely. Understanding grows through this process, shaped by the interplay between what is known and what remains open. This state of partial knowledge does not diminish the significance of what has been discovered. Instead, it reflects the scale and complexity of the environment, where complete understanding requires sustained observation over time. The trench continues to present aspects that are not yet fully understood, inviting further exploration that extends beyond current boundaries. In this way, the unknown remains an integral part of the narrative, not as an absence to be filled immediately, but as a space that guides future observation. It defines the direction of continued study, shaping how each new descent contributes to a broader understanding that continues to evolve. Familiarity depends on repetition, on environments that can be returned to, seen from different angles, and gradually understood through experience. In the case of the trench, that repetition remains limited, and the opportunities for direct encounter are rare. What is known has been gathered in brief intervals, each visit separated by long gaps, leaving the environment only partially integrated into human perception. The conditions themselves resist comparison. Pressure, darkness, and isolation combine in ways that have no direct equivalent in everyday experience. These factors are not simply variations of what is known, but represent a set of circumstances that cannot be easily translated into familiar terms. Without reference points, the mind attempts to interpret the environment through analogy, yet these comparisons remain incomplete, unable to fully capture what exists at such depth. Exposure remains minimal. Very few individuals have directly experienced this environment, and even then, only within controlled conditions that limit interaction. Most understanding comes through instruments, images, and data, each providing a representation rather than a direct encounter. This distance shapes perception, creating a gap between what is observed and what can be fully comprehended. Visualization becomes a challenge within this context. The absence of light removes a primary means through which environments are typically understood. Even when artificial illumination is introduced, it reveals only a small portion of the surroundings at any given time. The broader landscape remains beyond view, requiring reconstruction through fragments rather than continuous observation. This fragmented perspective makes it difficult to form a complete mental image, leaving the environment partially defined. The scale of the trench further contributes to this unfamiliarity. Its dimensions extend beyond what can be easily conceptualized, and its features vary in ways that are not immediately apparent. Without consistent visual or physical reference, the environment becomes abstract, understood through description rather than direct perception. This abstraction reinforces the sense of distance, placing the trench outside the range of environments that can be readily imagined. Psychological distance develops alongside these factors. The trench exists as a place that is known to exist, yet remains largely inaccessible. It is present within scientific understanding, but absent from direct human experience. This separation influences how it is perceived, creating a sense that it belongs to a different category of environment, one that is acknowledged but not fully integrated into the broader sense of the world. Even as knowledge expands, this unfamiliarity persists. Each new observation adds detail, yet it does not fully resolve the distance between understanding and experience. The environment remains difficult to internalize, shaped by conditions that do not align with common reference points. What is learned contributes to a growing body of information, but the overall perception remains incomplete. In this way, the trench continues to exist at the edge of familiarity, not because it is unknown, but because it cannot be easily translated into terms that align with human experience. It remains present within knowledge, yet distant within perception, shaped by conditions that resist full integration into the ways environments are typically understood. Progress here does not arrive as a sudden expansion, but as a gradual extension of reach, where each improvement in capability allows access to places that were previously beyond contact. The boundary of exploration shifts slowly, shaped by advances that refine how descent, observation, and return are managed. What was once limited by material strength, data collection, and duration begins to open, not all at once, but through steady refinement of the tools used to enter this environment. Engineering continues to evolve, focusing not only on endurance, but on precision. Materials become more resilient, designs more efficient, and systems more integrated, allowing submersibles and remotely operated platforms to remain stable under conditions that once imposed strict limits. Improvements in sensors increase the ability to detect subtle variations in the environment, capturing details that would have been missed in earlier missions. These changes extend the depth of observation, revealing layers of information that were previously inaccessible. With these advancements comes the possibility of more frequent exploration. Missions that once required long intervals between attempts begin to occur with greater regularity, each descent building upon the last. This repetition increases the continuity of observation, allowing patterns to be tracked with greater clarity. Changes that occur over time become more visible, and the accumulation of data begins to form a more detailed understanding of the trench as a dynamic system. Autonomous technologies also contribute to this shift. Devices capable of operating independently can remain in the environment for extended periods, collecting information beyond the duration of human presence. These systems move through the trench with a degree of persistence that was not previously possible, extending the range of exploration while maintaining stability within challenging conditions. Their observations add depth to the record, capturing processes that unfold over longer timescales. As exploration expands, the potential for new findings remains constant. Each previously unvisited region offers the possibility of encountering forms of life, geological features, or chemical processes that have not yet been observed. The trench, vast and varied, contains areas that differ in ways not fully understood, suggesting that current knowledge represents only a portion of what exists. Each extension of reach introduces the chance to encounter these differences directly. This expansion does not eliminate uncertainty, but it transforms how it is approached. Unknown areas become targets for investigation, guided by patterns observed in known regions. Exploration becomes more systematic, directed by hypotheses that emerge from accumulated data. The process remains open, shaped by discovery, yet grounded in a growing framework that guides where and how to look. The future of exploration in this environment is therefore defined by continuity. Each advancement builds upon previous efforts, extending capability while maintaining connection to what has already been learned. The trench remains a place where much is yet to be seen, but the means to explore it continue to develop, gradually increasing the scope of what can be observed. In this way, the possibility of future discoveries is not distant or abstract. It is embedded within the ongoing progression of technology and exploration, unfolding through repeated engagement with an environment that continues to reveal itself in measured, incremental ways. Recognition does not arrive with a single moment of clarity, but through the steady accumulation of observations that begin to align in a different way. What was once assumed to be absence has gradually taken on form, not through dramatic revelation, but through the persistence of detail that continues to emerge with each return. The trench, long imagined as a quiet expanse, reveals itself instead as a place shaped by ongoing processes where presence exists even when it is not immediately visible. This understanding settles slowly. It does not overturn what came before, but reshapes it, allowing earlier assumptions to shift without disappearing entirely. The idea of emptiness gives way to a recognition of subtle activity, where movement, interaction, and transformation occur at scales that require careful attention to perceive. Nothing here announces itself with urgency, yet everything participates in a system that remains active beneath the surface of observation. Life, once thought unlikely in such conditions, appears not as an isolated occurrence, but as part of a broader pattern. Organisms exist in forms that reflect the environment, their presence integrated into processes that extend across the seafloor and beneath it. These forms do not dominate their surroundings, but align with them, contributing to a continuity that connects biological and geological activity. The trench becomes a place where these interactions unfold quietly, each element influencing the others in ways that are not always immediately apparent. Complexity emerges through this interaction. Chemical processes, physical movement, and biological activity intersect, creating systems that operate with a degree of organization that had not been anticipated. These systems do not follow familiar patterns, yet they remain consistent within their own context, shaped by conditions that define how they function. Understanding them requires a shift in perspective, one that accepts variation rather than expecting similarity. At the same time, much of this environment remains beyond direct observation. What has been seen represents only a portion of what exists, with vast areas still unvisited and processes still unrecorded. The trench extends beyond the reach of current exploration, its full extent continuing into regions that remain unexamined. This absence of complete knowledge does not diminish what has been learned, but places it within a larger framework where understanding remains partial and evolving. The unseen becomes part of this realization. It is not simply what is missing, but what is implied by what has already been observed. Each confirmed detail suggests the presence of others, extending beyond the boundaries of current knowledge. The trench, in this sense, is defined as much by what is yet to be discovered as by what has already been revealed. In this way, the deepest place on Earth is understood not as an empty space, but as a system that continues to operate with a quiet persistence. It is active, complex, and shaped by interactions that unfold without drawing attention to themselves. Much of it remains unseen, yet what has been observed provides enough to recognize that this environment exists as part of a broader, continuous process, one that extends beyond immediate perception and continues to develop beyond what is currently known. There is a quiet perspective that settles in after tracing these depths for so long, one that does not arrive with finality, but with a gentle awareness of scale. What has been observed, recorded, and carefully interpreted forms only a narrow window into a planet that remains largely unexamined. The trench stands as a reminder, not of absence, but of how much still exists beyond the edges of direct understanding, waiting without urgency to be seen more clearly. The ocean, in its vastness, holds a continuity that stretches far beyond any single descent. It is not defined by the regions already explored, but by the countless areas that remain untouched, each shaped by processes that unfold without interruption. The deepest places are not separate from this whole, but part of a larger system that continues to operate whether observed or not. What has been revealed offers direction, yet it does not complete the picture. This sense of incompleteness does not diminish what has been learned. Instead, it gives it context, placing each discovery within a broader landscape of possibility. The trench becomes less of a destination and more of a beginning point where understanding expands outward rather than closing in. Each detail contributes to a growing awareness, one that remains open, shaped by what is known and what is still beyond reach. There is a kind of stillness in recognizing that the unknown is not something to be resolved quickly. It exists as part of the natural rhythm of exploration, where progress unfolds over time, guided by patience and sustained attention. The ocean continues to hold its depth, its complexity, and its quiet activity unchanged by how much of it has been seen. It remains steady, allowing understanding to approach gradually. In this space, curiosity becomes a form of continuity. It does not demand immediate answers, but moves forward with a steady interest in what might be revealed next. The act of observing, of returning, of refining what is known becomes part of a longer process that extends beyond any single moment. The trench, like the rest of the ocean, invites this kind of engagement, one that unfolds without urgency, yet never fully concludes. If this journey into the deep has stayed with you, you are part of that ongoing exploration. Your perspective adds to the quiet exchange of ideas that continues beyond these observations. Share your thoughts on what might exist in these unseen regions, not as conclusions, but as reflections that extend the conversation further. And if this kind of slow, careful exploration is something you would like to continue experiencing, consider supporting it in a simple way. Leaving a like and subscribing helps these stories reach further, allowing more of this quiet, unfolding perspective to continue. There is always more to see, more to understand, and more to gently uncover as the ocean remains vast and patient, holding its depth just beyond the edge of what is known.